On behalf of the Friendswood Library, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation. Dr. John Charles has been at the Johnson Space Center since 1983, where he investigated the cardiovascular effects of spaceflight on space shuttle astronauts and on crew members of the Russian space station Mir. He was mission scientist for the NASA research on American astronauts on Mir, on John Glenn's space shuttle flight, and on Columbia's last mission in January of 2003. Charles is now the chief of the International Science Office of NASA's Human Research Program and leads space life sciences planning for the joint U.S.-Russian one-year mission on the ISS. He is a fellow of the Aerospace Medical Association and a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics, has published over 60 scientific articles, and has received several professional awards. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Charles.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here tonight to talk to you about a very interesting project that we are all engaged in. A few of us in this room directly because of our day-to-day job, our work, and the rest of you because you're taxpayers and you make this all possible. And that project is sending people to Mars. It seems like that's the first thing people want to talk about when we say we're at NASA. Are we going to go to Mars? And the answer is getting to be more and more likely to be yes. So let's talk about that. I'll tell you about the biomedical aspects of sending people to Mars. I'm not going to tell you very much about rockets because I'm not a rocket scientist. I'm not even a rocket surgeon. I'm just a Ph.D. physiologist that has an interest in doing this kind of stuff professionally and been lucky enough to do it for a long time. So I'll tell you what I've learned along the way, and if you have better information, please correct me. First, we're going to talk about how to get between here and there, and there are several charts in this presentation that look programmatic. I'm giving you the same kind of briefing I give to senior NASA managers. So I've made sure to use small words and short sentences. And the interesting thing to look at here is the fact that we have actually recently broken down how to get to Mars into 5 easy steps. These are the steps along the bottom here. You see there's Phase 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you add them all up, there are 5 steps. They culminate in Mars in maybe the 2030s. That's about 13-ish years from now or slightly longer. And that is phases 3 and 4. Phase 3 is orbiting Mars or flying by Mars, and phase 4 is actually landing on the planet Mars. Phases 1 and 2 are practicing and getting experience in the environment near Earth's moon. That's called cislunar. NASA does not currently have any plans to land on the moon. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt back in the 1960s and 70s. But other folks may choose to land on the moon. NASA proposes, and it has not yet been officially established, but NASA proposes to build a small space station orbiting near the moon from which a landing mission might be mounted. And if any of our international partners, the Europeans, the Russians, the Canadians, the Japanese, want to build a lander and land on the moon, we've got a place where they can dock and resupply and then go down to the moon and maybe take one of our astronauts with them. Those are phases 1 and 2. Phase 0 is the phase we're in right now, and I'm kind of miffed that our chart makers made this phase 0 because I think it's a really good phase. It deserves at least a digit in there. And that is to use the International Space Station, that which is in orbit around the Earth right now, every day since 1999 and early 2000, carrying people on board, learning how to live in space and how to continue to move forward into space. So that's the stage we're in now. That's the venue for a lot of the work that we do in the Human Research Program to try and understand how to move beyond low Earth orbit. And I'll be telling you about the work that we're doing there and how it then informs and enables the work into moving into the rest of the solar system, starting with the planet Mars. First, I have to orient you. You are on Earth, that is this one right here. The big yellow one in the middle is the sun. Don't get those confused because you get a wicked sunburn. And then the little red one, or the red one that's a little bit further away from the sun than the Earth, is Mars. So this is a very simple diagram of the route from Earth to Mars. You'll notice there's a couple of curvy lines. There's a curvy line from Earth to Mars, and there's a curvy line from Mars back to Earth. And then there's a larger reddish line here that I'll tell you all about. So let's imagine we're going to go to Mars. We decide one day, it'd be fun to go to Mars. We'll go hop into our rocket ship and take off. Luckily, we've chosen the correct day out of about a 2-year cycle, because when we depart Earth and we follow the trajectory that our fuel allows, we come to the orbit of Mars when Mars is at that location. Luckily, the planet's there when we get there. Imagine how embarrassing it would be to go all that way and miss the entire planet of Mars. That's possible because you have adhered to the launch window. There's a certain time every 2+ years when you can depart from the Earth and arrive at Mars. Similarly, there's a similar time when you can depart from Mars and arrive at Earth. Those transits take 6 or 7 or 8 months, depending on a lot of things that are higher math, and I'm a biologist, so I don't do higher math, but trust me, it's legit. So let's call it 6 months to Mars and 6 months back to Earth. But how about the layover? Now, you've all flown American Airlines through Dallas, so you know what I'm talking about. You may spend the night in Dallas without meaning to. Well, if you're on this trip, you're going to lay over on Mars for 18 months, 1.5 Earth years, 18 months. So 6 months out, 18 months doing really, really important stuff, and then 6 months to come back. That's 18 plus 6 is 24 plus 6 is 30, 30 months for a round-trip mission to Mars. And we only sell round-trip tickets. You don't get a one-way trip going to Mars if you're working with NASA. 2.5 years for a trip to Mars and back. That informs all of our thinking and planning for how to send astronauts from the Earth to Mars. The 6-month trip to Mars is nicely mimicked by the current tour of duty, the current rotation of astronauts on the International Space Station, so that we in the life sciences can understand what astronauts' conditions might be when they arrive at Mars by looking at the conditions of the astronauts after a 6-month tour of duty on the International Space Station. That allows us then to inform the engineers what the condition of the astronauts will be when they land on Mars eventually, and they can design the rocket ships and the space capsules appropriately. So this is the big picture. 6 months plus 18 months plus 6 months. There'll be a quiz later. Now, if we're talking about sending people to Mars or anywhere actually beyond low Earth orbit, there are several factors that we have to keep in mind. And this is a nice picture to sort of bring it all together. The first thing we have to keep in mind is the fact that beyond low Earth orbit, and especially beyond Earth's magnetic fields, which traps a lot of radiation, there is a lot of radiation. There's still a lot of radiation out there. There's radiation from the sun, highly energetic protons and electrons, and there's also radiation from the rest of the universe. The rest of the universe is busy energizing atomic nuclei to high velocities, relativistic speeds, the speed of light essentially, and shipping them all towards Earth. At least it seems like it. Actually, they're shipped all throughout the universe, but Earth just happens to pick up a lot of them along the way. I had a friend that was a flight surgeon who used to say we shouldn't call it outer space, we should just call it radiation, because that's what it's full of, is radiation. So we have to worry about the effects of radiation. Luckily, the effects of radiation are not as dire as you have heard from everybody else who's ever spoken to you about going to Mars. The radiation on a Mars flight will not cause you to grow a third hand out of your forehead, will not kill you immediately, will not fry you. It can cause an increased risk of cancer later in life, and by that I mean 20 years after your Mars mission. But it may also cause some increase in vascular problems, atherosclerosis and cardiovascular problems. And the part that we're most concerned about is the effect of radiation on your brain. The fact that some of these highly energetic particles might just accidentally zip through your brain and interrupt the very process you're using to try and figure out which way to point your rocket ship for a successful landing on Mars. That's our big concern. Luckily, there are ways to protect against that for the most part, shielding and storm shelters for the solar particles, and just being lucky for the galactic cosmic radiation. Actually, it turns out that the sun is actually a good way to protect against the galactic cosmic radiation. That is, the radiation from the sun actually pushes back on the galactic cosmic radiation, so it's actually slightly safer to travel beyond Earth's magnetosphere when the sun is more active, the high sunspot part of the solar cycle, versus when the sun is more quiescent. There's a cycle of about 11 years, and if you're lucky, you'll get the Mars flight that happens when the sun is more active, because you'll have less galactic cosmic radiation and less significant damage. No guarantees, that's all averages. The other thing you have to worry about is altered gravity fields. We have all been blessed to be living in what's called normal gravity, or Earth gravity, or 1 times gravity. And that's the same G field that's been on the Earth since the beginning, since the Earth was formed. And it's the G field that we have all experienced every day of our lives, unless any of us here are astronauts, and I don't recognize any right now, so I'm going to assume there are none. It's the G field that's pulling me down on the ground, on the bottom of my feet, and on the bottom of your chairs. You're feeling your normal body weight, 1 times gravity. If I could snap my fingers and transport you immediately to Mars, you'd be feeling 1/3 of that. You'd be feeling 3/8 of a G, 38% of a G, which, because I'm not mathematically inclined, I call that 1/3 of a G. And that's the gravity field you would feel on the surface of Mars. Mars is a smaller planet, and it exerts less pull because of gravity. During the transit from Earth to Mars, you'd be feeling weightlessness, 0 gravity, what some people like to call microgravity. I don't like that term for various reasons. I'm a stickler about some things, and that's one of them. But let's call it weightlessness. You weigh essentially 0 gravity. When you see astronauts orbiting the Earth, they look like they're weightless. That's because they're experiencing 0 gravity through a variety of physical causes. Not important, not going to be in the quiz. So when you're traveling to Mars or back from Mars, you're feeling 0 gravity. When you're launching off of the Earth in your big rocket ship, you're going to feel maybe 6 Gs, 6 times normal gravity. When you're entering the atmosphere of Mars and slowing down, you're going to feel 5 or 6 Gs. When you're blasting off of Mars, you're going to feel 4 or 5 Gs. When you're entering the atmosphere of the Earth, just before you're splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, you'll feel 4 or 5 or 6 Gs again, depending on how carefully you have aimed. So there's going to be a lot of variety in your gravitational environment. There's going to be the hostile closed environment. Now you're inside of a closed environment. When you're traveling from the Earth to Mars, you're inside of a spaceship. Nobody's surprised by that. We've all seen the movies. We know what spaceships look like. And we know on the outside is an eyeball-popping, lung-sucking out vacuum that will kill you immediately. So that environment inside of your spaceship is the safest place you can be except back on Earth. It's also potentially a hostile environment because everything inside there is being recycled over and over again, like they say about life on the space station, making tomorrow's coffee out of yesterday's coffee. Water gets recycled, air gets recycled. If we're good, we're going to be able to recycle solids as well and make tomorrow's pancakes out of yesterday's egg McMuffin. Who knows? So when you when you cycle things over and over again, you filter out the impurities, and if you recycle them often enough, those impurities sort of accumulate and become potentially toxic. So you got to make sure to scrub your filters at the required interval to make sure that things don't build up to become toxic. Toxins don't accumulate to a dangerous level. Anyhow, generally speaking, I know I can tell by looking at you that you're all very diligent. You'll keep your environment clean and healthy, so it's going to be a less hostile, closed environment. We also have to worry about isolation and confinement. It'll be you and 3 of your closest personal friends inside of a vehicle that's much smaller than this room for the 2.5 years. You will be face to face, I mean literally face to face with you and 3 other people inside of a volume that's very small as you execute a very delicate, dangerous, risky, high visibility mission. You'll be isolated in a way that nobody's ever been isolated before because you're going to be further away from Earth and further away from everybody else that has ever existed than anybody's ever been before. You're going to be 100 million miles away at some points during your mission. And you'll be confined, like I say, in an extremely small volume. So I hope you've chosen your crewmates well. No fair cannibalizing any of them if you decide you don't like the way they dress in the morning. And it's all driven by the distance from the Earth. Like I say, at your closest, you'll be 34 million miles away from Earth, and at your furthest, you'll be 93 million plus 34 million miles. You'll be 120 million miles away on the far side of the sun at the midpoint of your Mars mission. It's important to think about that, the fact that the distance from the Earth drives many of the complications that I've just described. And as a way of illustrating it graphically, I'm showing you this picture, which is not a picture taken of the horizon on the Earth, but a picture taken by one of the rovers of the horizon on Mars, I think just after sunset. And the evening star in this case is not Venus, but it's actually Earth. You can't see it very well. Here, let me show you. There's Earth right there. That little tiny dot right there is the best view you get of Earth from Mars. That's how close, that's the closest Earth gets to Mars. And most of the time, it's even less obvious than that. So this is just a graphic illustration of what it's going to be like for you and your 3 personal best friends on Mars. Now luckily, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. I'm part of the Human Research Program. I cut off the last letter in mission, but our mission is to enable space exploration beyond low Earth orbit. And our job is to reduce the risks to astronauts in spaceflight by doing basic applied and operational research, heavy on the applied research. And we do research that leads to standards, that is the rules of the road. Standards become requirements, and requirements are what the engineers need to build rocket ships. We build countermeasures and other means that mitigate risks to astronauts in spaceflight, and I'll tell you more about that as we go along. And we develop advanced habitability and medical support technologies, the things, the technology for the habitat that you're living in, the technology for the medical support that keeps you healthy and happy in this environment. Just for fun, I'll tell you that we, the Human Research Program, which is abbreviated by HRP because we are NASA, so we don't ever say long words, we just say abbreviations. We're composed of 5 elements: the element that takes care of plans for long-term medical care, the element that takes care of human factors and psychosocial aspects of the long-duration spaceflight, the physiology department, essentially the one that worries about cardiovascular, bone, muscle, immune system, balance, all those kinds of things. The radiation department that worries about, let's see, what do they worry about? Oh yes, radiation. And the medical, ISS medical project, which is good at taking all of these other people's wish lists and making them into flight experiments that can actually go to the space station and be tested in spaceflight. Just because I'm a scientist, I want to show you the funniest picture in tonight's presentation, and that is this calendar of projected future scientific breakthroughs. Okay, those of you that are laughing get the joke. You must all be scientists. This is no fooling. We have listed many of the risks we're working on. We've identified a set of risks. We've listed the risks here, and we've projected how far into the future in years before we can convert those risks from red, which means we really don't know what we're talking about, to yellow, which means, okay, we probably got it figured out, to green, which means, okay, we got an answer, and even to blue, which means not only have we got an answer, we got a good answer, a smooth, efficient answer. So the goal here is to get everything from red to green. And you can see that things like space radiation or the cognition and psychological aspects of space flight and so forth are red right now, but they're going to get green and soon enough, yellow and green soon enough. And some things are already yellow, which means we think we understand those pretty well. One of the important deadlines we have is this right here in fiscal year 24, which ends September 30th of 2024. That is when we think we're going to lose access to the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station will not immediately vaporize at that time. It will continue to exist, but it will become progressively more expensive to support because at that point it'll be 25 years old, having been in space for 25 years, lots of wear and tear on it. And at that point, the space agency may decide, you know what, it's just so expensive, we don't want to really keep sending people to it anymore because bad things might start happening to it because of mechanical problems. So our goal is to finish up as much of our research as we can on the International Space Station before then, although there will probably be a grace period of maybe a few years after that. But there might also be some other venues after that as well where we can continue doing our risk reduction research and make this cartoon calendar turn all blue or all green in those years. We're doing research on the International Space Station. We're doing space radiation research actually not in space. We're doing it on the ground because we can better duplicate the environment of deep space radiation on the ground. In low Earth orbit, we really don't have access to the deep space radiation. We're doing isolation studies in several facilities, some of them here at the Johnson Space Center, and actually some of them in Russia. We're actually renting a very large facility in Moscow to do some really, really long multi-month, 4-month, 8-month, or 12-month isolation studies to understand how best to prepare astronauts for long-duration flights. And we're also using a very nice facility in the beautiful city of Cologne, Germany, which has lots of capabilities for bed rest studies, which simulate weightlessness, for change in atmosphere studies, so we can mimic the environment of the space station, and so forth. So we're doing this research in all of these different locations. But it really boils down to the International Space Station, your ISS, like I told you before. As a taxpayer, this is really the product of your investment. And it's a large facility. The U.S. segment here, the Russian segment here, and then these large things are also provided by your tax dollars, the solar panels and the truss. So it's a big facility. It's a world-class facility. You can see it with your naked eye when it flies over. It's as bright as Venus. Those of you that are familiar with space flight may remember, anybody here remember the Apollo flights? Show of hands. Who was here during the Apollo? Okay, we all remember Apollo because we've seen Apollo 13, but who was here during Apollo the Apollo era? Who saw astronauts go to the moon with their own eyeballs, or at least watched it live on TV? Okay. Since then, many people, including many of my fellow NASA employees, most of whom are engineers, just diminish the kind of work that we've done since then on the space shuttle and the space station as going around in circles, just burning holes in the sky, just doing the same thing over and over again, nothing as manly and heroic as we did before in Apollo, when we actually explored another planet and actually sent 12 men, all men, to another planet in the solar system. So that was the theme of an editorial cartoon by Tom Towles in the Washington Post in 2003. And you've already read this, but human spaceflight is necessary because it's the only way to do research on the effects of space on the human body, without which we can't do human spaceflight. It's a circular argument. He was very pleased with his little insight, and lots of folks agree with him. Like I say, the human research in spaceflight, yes, that's exactly what we're doing on the International Space Station. We are doing our homework. We're in elementary school or maybe high school, getting ready to go to do graduate work and or college work and then graduate work in the environment of the moon. But right now, we are learning the lessons that will make it possible to send astronauts beyond low Earth orbit safely and effectively, and most importantly, efficiently, so they can do the work that we want to send them to do with efficiency, and not returning by the skin of their teeth, but returning with enough energy to continue to have happy lives, to run for Congress, to run for president, to become movie stars and write books and go in the lecture circuit and all that kind of stuff. We're not asking anybody to expend themselves completely by going to Mars, and that's what we're doing all this research for. So I hope I will convince you before this session's over that this is a good investment. Like I say, on the space station, we're doing work in all of these areas. We're understanding how to select the right astronauts, how to keep them healthy and fit through exercise, the right nutrition, the right medications, how to keep the nutrition and the medications effective in space flight, what to do when our best guesses don't work and we have to work around, and developing other countermeasures. And it's really interesting just to look at some of these typical pictures of astronauts, including here my friend Mike Barrett, astronaut Dr. Mike Barrett, who's showing the proper way to travel through the space station carrying luggage, which is to put it between your knees and just use your arms and your hands to pull yourself along, because your legs essentially are useless in space unless you're running on a treadmill. So you may as well put them to work and do something useful like a pack animal. Here's Sunny Williams doing a blood draw on herself. I'm impressed how many astronauts, namely all of them, have learned to take their own blood. I couldn't do that. I couldn't be an astronaut because I'm not good at sticking a needle in my own body, but they get real comfortable with that. So this is the kind of things that astronauts are doing for us. And in doing so for us, they're helping us understand what happens to the human body in spaceflight. This is an example of a recent astronaut whose name you probably all remember hearing, Scott Kelly, who spent 1 year on the International Space Station, half of a duo, Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko, an American and a Russian, who spent a year on the space station. And this is a nice graphic illustrating the fact that all of the data collection he did during his time on the space station was not all he did. He also did a lot of pre-flight data collection so we could establish the baseline of what was happening to his body in flight. And then he also volunteered for a lot of post-flight data collection, essentially for a year after his mission ended, so we could track his recovery to normal post-flight. I got to tell you that sometimes in an audience like this, not this audience, but audiences other than this, somebody will raise their hand and say, do you guys at NASA, when you do all these measurements on the astronauts in flight, do you do the same measurements on them before flight so you know how they've changed in flight? And I always go, holy cow. Never occurred to us. We've been doing this for 50 years, and it never had, hey guys, listen, we should be doing this stuff before flight so we know how they change in flight. The answer is yes. In fact, we do. We do a lot of data collection on them before flight, so we try to get a good baseline and then understand how that baseline changes in spaceflight. And we've recently done, like I say, a very complex set of investigations on the International Space Station that took up that year in flight. Darn it, this didn't come out really well. This says 340 days in space, close enough for government work. Because every time I say a year in space flight, you think 365 days. And our astronauts flew on the space station for 340 days. And why is the NASA dude calling that a year in space? Don't you know that's 25 days short? And I say, give me a break. It's 11 months. It's 4 seasons. It was decided by the Russian launch schedule, not by anything we did. So please give me credit for a year in space, but 340 days, because it's pretty darn close enough for government work. And that's the logo for our one-year mission. If you know anything about the space business, if you don't have a logo, then you really just don't count. So we have a nice logo. And coincidentally, and this all does feed back to the discussion about Mars, coincidentally, the astronauts selected for the year-long mission, Scott Kelly, just happened to have with him a twin brother, Mark Kelly, the first and only pair of identical twin astronauts selected as astronauts by any space agency, in this case by NASA, well over 10 years ago. They each flew 4 missions. Mark flew 4 shuttle missions. Scott flew 2 shuttle missions and 2 missions to the International Space Station. And because they're just regular guys, they thought it would be okay if we did some comparative measurements on Scott and on Mark. So we actually did control studies on Mark to duplicate the work that we were doing on Scott to understand in 2 people who are more closely related than anybody ever else has been, any 2 people ever have been in spaceflight, so we can understand the effects of spaceflight better by making these comparisons. This also led us to move directly into, there's our logo, directly into the omics domain, that is the gene domain, the genetic domain, where we can make measurements down at the molecular level of their chromosomes. This was the first opportunity for astronauts that we have done that in a big way. And it really is just because Scott happened to have an identical brother, Mark, and they were both willing to be subjects. Scott was one of maybe half a dozen astronauts who was in consideration for the year-long mission, and if NASA had chosen any of the other astronauts to fly the year-long mission, then none of them have identical twin brothers, and it would never have occurred to us to do the genetic studies. But because we have done them, we have now seen the value, the power of genetics. We sort of came into the 21st century 15 years late, but we're better late than never. We've got the data, we got the insight, we've got a community of investigators that are willing to help us do this, and I think we're going to see great things in the future from our genetic-based investigations. It all leads, like I say, to Mars, and I want to tell you about how we're going to get to Mars and what I think it's going to do to the human bodies. I am using as my source something that's called Design Reference Architecture 5.0. This is the Mars Design Reference Mission. This is probably not the way anybody will ever go to Mars, but it is a good straw man depiction of a complete Mars mission from launch to arrival on Mars and to arrival back on Earth. And it's a good way we can all work toward the same mission. I took a few moments earlier on to tell you that to describe the scenario, the 6 months out, the 18 months on planet, and the 6 months back, because anytime you talk to anybody besides me about a trip to Mars, they will tell you, well, it's going to take a year to get there, and it's going to be a 3-year mission, or it may be 4 months to get there, and it's going to be a 500-day mission. There are a variety of different mission architectures, all of them valid depending on how much you want to invest in rocket engines and stuff like that. We have decided that all of us will choose a single Mars mission scenario to work toward, and that's what we're using for our biomedical research. So nobody can say, well, you know, you got that result because you picked a hard way to go to Mars and there's actually an easier way. We just all pick the same way. It's sort of a conformity kind of thing. And I've already described this to you. Just recapping, how long does it take to get from Earth to Mars? 6 months. How long does it take to get from Mars to the Earth? How long do you lay over on Mars? 18 months. Very good. And this is sort of what the scenario would look like if you buy into our design reference mission. Over the course of about a month, maybe 2 months in one particular launch window, several really big rockets, the Saturn V class rockets. Everybody here seen the Saturn V at the Johnson Space Center? You know how big that is. This is the next generation version of that. It's called the SLS, the Space Launch System. We're going to start flying those, I hope, in the next couple of years on flights to the moon, but they are intended specifically to support missions to Mars. A fleet of them, 4 of them, will be launched at about, I think, at about 1 week intervals, maybe a little bit more, and deposit into low Earth orbit the rocket stage and the payload, and the rocket stage and the payload of 2 cargo vehicles, which will then fire their rocket stages and travel to Mars and orbit Mars, waiting for astronauts to arrive eventually. The astronauts will not arrive immediately, though, because this has seen the opening and the closing of that launch window for that year. So we will have to wait 2+ more years to get ready for the next wave of hardware to go to Mars. And 2+ years later, 3 more vehicles, according to this scenario, are put together. One to launch another rocket stage, one to launch another payload, and one to launch the astronauts and an Orion capsule to dock with this, and this is the crew vehicle that will go to Mars, arrive in orbit around Mars, and transfer astronauts to a landing vehicle. The landing vehicle will land on Mars. The astronauts will inhabit the habitat there for 500 days while they're exploring the planet as far as they can get from that landing site in their roving vehicles, or if they feel like walking a really long distance, they can do that. After 500 days on Mars, they will then blast off, get back into the vehicle that brought them, come back to Earth, and at the last possible minute, get back into their Orion space capsule and re-enter the atmosphere, splashing down into the Pacific Ocean just like the Apollo astronauts did, this time not far from San Diego. If you've got nothing to do in about the middle 2030s, you might hang around San Diego and see if the astronauts splash down there. So this is a 30-month mission. It's a 26-month interval, 2 years between these two launch campaigns, and then I described to you the 30-month, 2.5-year mission to send astronauts there and back. This is how we think astronauts probably will end up going to Mars, or at least this is, like I say, the scenario we're working toward. It may be that the first time we send people, they will only orbit Mars, perhaps even to visit a couple of the moons, or 2 moons. There are 2 moons of Mars. You save a lot of money by not building the lander, but you have the disadvantage of going all the way to Mars and not landing on it. Some people think that's an unbearable psychological burden. I personally think it's not a bad idea not to get that red dust all over me. That's not the only way people have proposed going to Mars. That's the way that we have decided is the most logical and consistent way to go to Mars, but other folks have other ideas. There's a fellow named Tito who several years ago proposed a mission strictly for inspiration purposes. And he said that he was going to get somebody to donate a space capsule and a big rocket and a habitat, and he was going to pick 2 people, a man and a woman, hopefully married, at least at the beginning of the mission, and put them in that capsule and send them on a round trip to Mars, leaving the Earth, flying by Mars, and then coming back to Earth in 500 days. He later decided he had to do it slightly differently, so I think he picked a 540-day mission. See, there's that 500 days I told you about. They will not land on Mars. They will not orbit Mars. They will just fly by Mars. And because of orbital mechanics, they'll fly by Mars, getting closest to Mars over local midnight on Mars. So they'll be flying past Mars on the side opposite the sun. So they'll look out their window and they'll know they're at Mars because they see nothing outside their window. They'll see stars everywhere else, and they'll see a big black disk where Mars is, and that's the shadow of Mars, and they'll take lots of pictures. And they'll come back and they'll show us the pictures, and we'll say, well, there's nothing in these pictures. I don't think you actually went to Mars. And they'll say, well, yes, we did, because it cost us $100 million each. And we'll say, well, it's a bad investment. So anyhow, this is a plan that has really gone nowhere, but it was intended to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers to go send missions to Mars. I'm not a millionaire. The guy that invented this mission, Tito, was a self-funded millionaire. He's actually the first self-funded astronaut. He paid his own way to the International Space Station and back. And I don't have anywhere near the money that he has, so I'm obviously not as smart as he is because I don't get it. But there's another guy that's also smart and has a lot more money than Tito, and this fellow's name is Elon Musk. Anybody here heard of Elon Musk? He's got the Tesla. Well, how did he make his money? Was it PayPal? PayPal. He made his money on PayPal. And he has currently got his own space program, which is doing work for NASA. They're launching resupply vehicles to NASA. You may be familiar with their Falcon rocket, which is taken to landing back at the launch site after it is blasted off. So it blasts off, it deposits the second stage on the way to orbit, then the first stage either lands on a big barge out in the ocean or back at the launch site. He has proposed to stick 3 of those Falcon 9 rockets together in a configuration he calls the Falcon Heavy, and put a capsule on top and send that capsule with paying passengers on it to the moon, make a loop around the moon, or in fact send that capsule without paying passengers on it and strip down, send it to Mars, so we can practice sending things to Mars and practice landing on Mars. He has proposed to do this, but just 1 week ago I was at a conference where he was speaking, and he said things like, you know, that turned out to be harder than I thought. We're probably not going to do this as much as we promised. So this Falcon Heavy is supposed to launch later this year, and he'll be using it for a lot of low Earth orbit and perhaps even lunar missions. He may not actually be sending this spaceship, a series of these spaceships to Mars to practice sending to Mars. In fact, he said, you know, the more we think about doing it this way, where you strap 3 of these Falcon 9 rockets together side by side and make them all launch together, He says, that's really hard and really dangerous. And he says, I just hope it gets far enough away from the launch pad when it explodes that it doesn't destroy the launch pad, because I got a lot of money invested in that launch pad. So we'll see how the first one works. Maybe this time next year they'll all be flying routinely and we'll all be very impressed. But he was doing that as a way of building up to his scenario for going to Mars. Elon Musk has an interest in space flight because he wants to go into space. He wants to go to Mars. In fact, his quote is, he wants to die on Mars of old age. He wants to colonize Mars, and there's lots of folks that want to go with him to colonize Mars. And he proposed a year ago in September at a big conference in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I was there. He proposed that he was going to build these rockets, these spaceships, 49.5 meters high, almost, let's call it 150 feet. Let's say 150 feet, bottom to top. That's as big as a space shuttle. And he was going to launch these to Mars on top of an even bigger booster stage. And he was going to do this routinely. So we're going to, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the best part. He's going to have 100 Mars colonists inside of it each time it flies. 100 people going to Mars. And he said, yeah, I think I can start doing this in 2025. So it's 2017 now. And here's the deal. He said he was going to build a rocket that's almost as big as a Saturn V, except it's a single stage rocket. And it will blast off and put the crew vehicle into orbit, where it will meet up with a couple of other crew vehicles that don't have people on them, but have fuel on them. It'll fuel up the one that's got people on it. The people will fly on a trip to Mars, and he thinks he can get there in 3 months or 4 months instead of the 6 months, because, you know, he's Elon Musk. He doesn't have to worry about those pesky laws of physics. And then he gets to Mars, lands, the gangplank rolls out, the 100 colonists step out and move into hopefully a very nice habitat. Or either hold their breath for a really long time. The rocket blasts off, comes back to Earth, lands near the launch pad that it departed from 3 or 4 or 5 months before, gets picked up by a big crane, put on top of another rocket, and flies another 100 colonists to Mars. He expects he's going to do this and put 1 million people on Mars. 1 million people on Mars. So he's proposing to do 1,000 round trips per rocket booster and 100 round trips per tanker and 12 round trips per crew vehicle. The idea that he's going to use each crew vehicle 12 times, and then he'll discard them because they'll be worn out by then. And a vehicle that looks this big, and he says he's going to start doing that in 2025. Now, again, I'm being a little bit unfair to Elon. I kid him. You know, we're tight. I took this selfie of me with him in Guadalajara, so you know we're buds. But he has since said, you know, that thing I said about the other rocket, well, ditto for this one. I'm going to come out in September of this year. So that means in just over 2 months from, or just over 1 month from now, and tell you how I've scaled back that capsule and how I've scaled back that booster. We're not going to fly 100 people at a time. We're just going to fly 25 people at a time because we got serious about the physics. So I'm anxious to see how this plan changes. So I've described to you NASA's program, which you are justified in considering a fantasy, because we haven't done it yet, although we're moving in that direction. And I've described to you Dennis Tito's program, which is, I hope you agree with me, is purest fantasy, because he hasn't got any plans to actually do it, but he wants to inspire people to go to Mars. And I've described Elon Musk's plan, which I hesitate to call a fantasy because, number one, I'm being recorded, and number two, he's so rich, he's got lots of lawyers out there, I'm sure he'd track me down. But he's also very good at doing things that other people haven't done, like building reusable rockets and landing them near the launch pad and flying them again. He may have some really wild, far out ideas, but some of the ideas are not so wild and far out, and he actually has the money to make them happen. So if anybody can do this, he can. And people ask me, is NASA mad or jealous or anything like that? And I say, no, we're cheering for him. We hope he can do that, because he's going to need us along anyhow. So this is a great thing, and if he doesn't do it, at least he'll have advanced the science and the technology. But let me tell you what NASA is planning on doing, and then let me give you some comparisons. What NASA is planning on doing after the space station era, and I told you we think the space station might make it through 2024 or maybe 2025 or 2026, but probably not much later than 2028, just because it's going to wear out essentially. After the space station era, NASA proposes to move beyond low Earth orbit. NASA proposes to leave the orbits around the Earth to commercial interests. And there are people that want to build commercial space stations as well as the Chinese want to build a space station. The Russians have talked about building a space station. There will be space stations in low Earth orbit. There will be places for you to go when you hit the lottery and you make all your millions. There will be tourist places to go. And NASA will actually be renting space on some of those space stations instead of having its own space station. NASA will just be another customer. But NASA is going to put its money into building what we call the Deep Space Gateway. I call it a mini space station. And it'll be placed not in orbit around the Earth, but in orbit very near the Moon. Not in orbit around the Moon, but in a, trust me, it'll be someplace near the Moon for a really long period of time. It'll be a deep space gateway, and the gateway implies that there will be something arriving and departing from there. So here's a nice graphic of what it might look like. Here's the gateway, here's the Orion capsule with the astronauts on board. The Orion is the next generation NASA vehicle that will take astronauts beyond low Earth orbit up to the Moon and perhaps even to Mars. This is based on essentially a space station module. I think I have a picture showing you what it looks like. Here's your International Space Station, and remember it's as big as a football field when you have the solar panels all deployed. Here is the gateway module, and it's about as big as one of these modules on the International Space Station. So it's going to be a lot smaller, a lot tighter, a lot closer quarters for the astronauts on board. I told you 4 people on board. Right now there's 6 people on the International Space Station in a space that's bigger than a 747 airliner on the inside. We're soon going to have 7 people on board. NASA is going to bump up its participation by 1 additional person. So this is the International Space Station, and this is the gateway for comparison. So keep that comparison in mind. Our goal, and I can tell you this because it's been officially publicized by Bill Gerstenmaier, our Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations at headquarters, the big cheese for human spaceflight. And he says, here's our go-forward plan. We're going to start flying this big Saturn V class rocket. I told you it's called the SLS, the Space Launch System. We're going to launch one of them unoccupied, unmanned, uncrewed in maybe 2018 or maybe 2019 now. We might launch the second one to take a deep space probe to one of the moons of Jupiter called Europa. Anybody know why Europa is of interest? It might be an ocean planet. It might be a planet that has got a crust of ice on top of a large globe globe encircling ocean. And if there's water, if that's water ice and water, it is believed that that might be the next best place to look for life, because our oceans are full of life. Wouldn't every ocean be full of life? So there might be a program to send something that's called the Europa Clipper on top of an SLS rocket to explore Europa, one of the satellites of Jupiter, to see if perhaps there is life there. But then back to the more mundane traffic from the Earth to the Moon, and another SLS rocket with the astronauts on board would carry a portion of that miniature space station. And these would launch about once a year. So a year later, another 4 people would go up and carry the habitat. And they would go to the Moon and leave their hardware behind and come back in about 3 weeks or 4 weeks. The next one would go up and leave the habitat and come back. The next one would go up and leave logistics, food, water, toilet paper, whatever you need to live. And the next one would go up and leave an airlock so people could go outside and do spacewalks to repair the parts that came up earlier. So over the course of a few years, between say 2020 and 2026, we hope we will see a miniature space station orbiting very near the Moon. And that's groovy. Then we've got this thing available for us. 4 astronauts every year go up there and spend just a few weeks getting things ready, then coming back. So it's not going to be permanently occupied like the International Space Station. So that's lovely, and this is what it's sort of going to look like. But then along about that time, another vehicle shows up, the Deep Space Transport. Hopefully, according to Mr. Gerstenmaier's plan, and I think it's a good plan, and I have to say that because he's my boss's boss, so I really think it's a good idea. Hopefully, the Deep Space Transport will be launched on top of one of these SLSs that is without astronauts. It's going to use every bit of thrust it has to put this vehicle into orbit near the Moon, near that gateway. And then over subsequent flights, over the next several years, astronauts will launch and take up logistics and so forth, and eventually outfit this thing to make it a standalone spacecraft. So this is the Deep Space Transport. It is docked with the Deep Space Gateway. The astronauts arrive in their Orion vehicle. They get into the Deep Space Gateway. These 2 vehicles are actually physically linked. They go through that, get into this one, and undock. And they spend 1 year orbiting free from everything near the Moon on a mission that is simulating a trip to Mars. They spend 300 to 400 days, according to this scenario, in that vehicle, treating the moon as if it was Mars and treating themselves as if they had arrived at Mars and they're exploring Mars from orbit. Then they get back, then they come back and dock with the habitat, get into their Orion capsule, come back to Earth, and a year later, 4 more astronauts take some logistics with them and go back up and do the same thing. They go to the gateway, they get into the transport, they undock, and this time they don't pretend they're going to Mars. They actually go to Mars inside this vehicle. So I'll let that sink in for a second. This is the first time somebody from NASA has told you, using official NASA documentation, that we're actually thinking about sending people to Mars if somebody doesn't stop us in the early 2030s. So that's 13 years from now. Yes, that's a really long time to you and me, and that's 91 in dog years. But for a space program in the current day, that's overnight. That is lickety-split. That's as fast as you can imagine going. And it is that way because, I say that because the vehicle that we're talking about sending to Mars in, say, 2033 or so, we hope to deliver it on location in to the moon at that habitat in 2027, which means it has to be ready to fly in 2027, which means we have to have finished designing it in 2022, which is just 5 years from now, which means we have to finish up all of our research that will lead to better life on a Mars vehicle practically overnight. I say 5 years is very soon because typically when we fund research by scientists, we give them 3-year contracts, which means we are 1 contract away from being done with the research that we think we need to do to make it possible to send a spacecraft to Mars. So I'm feeling the pressure. I hope you're starting to feel a little bit of the pressure too. Luckily, you've got folks like me and a few of my friends here in the audience who are worried about this stuff on a full-time basis. But we may actually be close to sending people to Mars, and by that I mean within a decade or so. And I do want to give you a little bit of a sense, again, of the dimensions. Here's the International Space Station. I described how big it is. When you saw the last movie you saw about people going to Mars, it was probably The Martian. Anybody see The Martian? You remember the vehicle that they were in? Hermes? I'm sorry, was it Hermes, the vehicle they were in? And it was this vehicle. It had a nice centrifuge so they could get artificial gravity. It had lots and lots of dramatic tunnels so they could zoom from one end of the spaceship to the other as impressive music built in the background, and they could go and save people and stuff like that. This is how big it is, and I think, I don't have dimensions for it, but just judging by the solar panels, I think I've got the right scale. So it's about as big as the International Space Station. Big difference, International Space Station actually exists. This is fiction. But if it was built according to what I think the specs were in the movie, it would look about the same size as the International Space Station for a trip to Mars. Here is the vehicle we're talking about sending astronauts in on a trip to Mars, and I used the scale of the habitat that I told you about is about as big as that module. That's right here, and then here's the transport. So 4 people inside of this going to Mars instead of 4 people inside of this going to Mars. Please forgive me, but that's the best we can do under the current circumstances, and this is really pretty much reality. This is how actual spaceflight happens versus movie spaceflight. Let's talk about the actual trip to Mars. Your trip to Mars will take how long? 6 months. And on that time, you're going to get further and further away from the Earth. It's going to get harder and harder to communicate with Earth. And you're going to be doing everything you can in your power to become ready for the final test, your final exam, which is to land on Mars and do useful work for 18 months. So you're going to be doing all the eating and exercising and studying and everything else you can during that outbound trip to Mars. Nobody will be bored on that outbound trip to Mars. There's going to be lots and lots and lots of work to do. First, the housekeeping. I told you about the hostile closed environment. You're going to keep your environment crystal clear, super duper clean so it doesn't turn hostile, so you can get on with the other activities you've got to do to go to Mars safely. Lots of simulations of upcoming mission events. Your spacecraft will be your simulator, will be your trainer, will be your Xbox. I mean, it's going to be everything you need to be prepared for future mission events. Housekeeping, training, some science along the way, maybe even driving rovers around on Mars as you get closer, and communications and healthcare, staying healthy, fit, and ready, charged up for the mission, for the landing on Mars. You're going to be worried about these kinds of factors. You're going to stay in good condition. And we worry about things like conditioning of astronauts. Here, an astronaut is doing zero gravity weightlifting. Yes, I said zero gravity weightlifting. He's using a device that uses pneumatics, compressed air, to simulate weight, but he's actually working against a load of up to 600 pounds as he's exercising. These astronauts come back buffer than when they launched. It's really a startling sight to see these people get out of their vehicles, and they're so big they almost don't fit in their spacesuits anymore because we have such a good exercise protocol for them on the space station. We will not have that capability in that little teeny tiny Mars vehicle. This module that he's in here is about as big as the entire Mars spaceship, and you can't fill that entire spaceship up with the exercise device. So we're going to be figuring out how we can compress this down to something about the size of a shoebox or two, and make sure that it does only those exercises that it needs to do to keep him in good enough shape to do the mission that we're sending him to do. But we should not be seeing people come back more buff than when they launched. We have to worry about medical events, the bad things that happen to good people on long duration flights, as they do to all of us here on the ground. And here's just a couple of pictures of astronauts doing medical things in space. Scott Kelly giving himself a flu shot for science purposes, but it could just as well be an inoculation for medical purposes. And we have to worry about the behavioral health and performance of astronauts, that is, the psychological, psychosocial factors of spaceflight. As I told you, when there's 4 of you in a vehicle the size of a space station module, there's going to be a lot of interpersonal tensions and pressures. Any 4 of the most highly motivated people in the world will still have issues, still have problems. Astronauts don't like to talk about that so much, at least not publicly. When they take pictures of each other and themselves, they always make sure they're in happy environments, happy settings. So I had to go to movies to pull out pictures of people having a bad day in space. And this is from Marooned. Anybody here see the movie Marooned, 1969? Gene Hackman played the astronaut who went bonkers in space, and Richard Crenna and James Franciscus had to sedate him. The astronauts do have the ability to restrain and sedate a crewmate that does go bonkers in space, but as far as I know, it's never actually had to be done. Anyhow, I had to use pictures from a movie to show you a bad day for an astronaut. I keep talking about the communication lag between astronauts and the distance between astronauts and the Earth, astronauts going to Mars and astronauts on the Earth. This is a picture of the distance. This is a plot of the distance between the Earth and Mars, because Earth and Mars orbit the Sun. Earth on the inside track, it goes faster. Mars on the outside track, it goes slower. Periodically, Earth is close to Mars. Then periodically, Earth pulls ahead of Mars and gets further away. Then periodically, it catches up from the back. And that's how come when you're going to Mars, you wait until Earth is approaching Mars. You jump from Earth to Mars. You arrive at Mars, and your radio waves, when you arrive at Mars, take about 8 minutes or so to go from Mars to the Earth. Then as you're doing your extremely hard work on Mars, Mars and Earth continue to separate. Earth pulls further ahead. And in the midpoint of the mission, Mars and Earth are about 22 minutes away by radio. So 44 minutes round trip. You say, "Hi, Mom, how are you doing?" And then you put the phone away and you go do something and come back 44 minutes later, and you'll hear Mom say, "Is that you, son?" I don't recognize the voice. So so that's at the midpoint of the mission. But then the nice point is, after the midpoint of the mission, you get closer as Earth catches up with Mars from the backside, and when it's time to leave, you're again 8 minutes away, and as you approach back to Earth, you're 0 minutes away because you're on Earth. So that's a brief explanation of the time lag. You now know more about the physics of going to Mars, and I'd say 99.9% of the people in the world. Congratulate, your certificates will be in the back. This is mission control in the movie. It will not look anything like that. Mission control during the Mars missions might be 3 or 4 people with laptops sort of on call, because the spacecraft will be so far away and have to be so autonomous, so self-supporting, that it will probably be largely self-controlling. The astronauts may well be self-controlling. Their pals in mission control might be a few folks with Wikipedia, so they can look up things that they need to know, but for the trivia contest. But other than that, it's going to be probably not as fancy as in the movie. I told you about some of the effects of spaceflight. I told you that we did several investigations on the 1-year mission. Here's an important one called the Fluid Shifts Investigation, designed to understand the effects of the body's fluid shifting, that is, the shifting of the body's fluids in spaceflight and weightlessness, which may be causing some effects that lead to decreased visual acuity. Vision is an important aspect of spaceflight. We want to understand if it's a real phenomenon and how bad it might get. And so we did some very complicated studies using lots of American hardware and lots of Russian hardware. We did it in the Russian module several times on several missions on the space station, specifically to understand the effects of spaceflight fluid shifting on vision. And as I said, the effects on vision may include changing of the shape of the eyeball. There may actually be enough pressure because of fluid shifting to flatten the eye a little bit and change the visual acuity to make the optic disc, that is where all the nerves enter the eye, or leave the eye, make that pop out, and make the optic nerve sheath swell up. All of these things are bad things to have happen to you on the Earth. They're not good things to have happen to you in space. So we're trying to understand exactly how much this happens in space, how much of it is related to fluid distribution, and whether we can do anything about it. The good news is it seems to be sort of a self-limiting problem, doesn't seem to be getting worse, it doesn't seem to be causing really permanent problems to astronauts. So we're thinking that we have this one pretty much covered, although the actual understanding of the biology is still yet to be acquired. I also want to show you, I told you a couple of things about spaceflight that relate to weightlessness, and if you're like a lot of my other audiences, you might say, well, why don't you guys at NASA just do what every movie has ever done and spin your spacecraft and make artificial gravity? And in fact, we have thought about that. Studies have gone way back into the 1960s to use artificial gravity on trips to Mars. Here's a study that we did in 2002 showing a 125-meter, about a 375-foot-long spacecraft with a habitat at one end that has 1 g, Earth normal gravity in it, and 4 revolutions per minute, which means it goes around in a circle 4 times a minute, every 15 seconds, and it generates normal gravity in the habitat. But that turns out to be really, really hard engineering-wise, at least it's complicated engineering-wise, and our director at headquarters has said, you know what, you guys are so good at keeping people alive in weightlessness, why don't we just sort of forget about this artificial gravity thing? So we spend a lot of time understanding artificial gravity, but we're about to start moving in the direction away from artificial gravity. So if you see a rotating spacecraft, it's probably science fiction. And again, to show you why we think this is essentially illustrating the artificial gravity capability of the movie spaceship in The Martian, the Hermes, and how big it is compared to the International Space Station. It turns out that if you do a lot of good exercise with resistive exercise, weightlifting, and aerobic exercise, you get many of the benefits of gravity without actually having to have gravity. And astronauts seem to like exercise. I could never be an astronaut. I'm not a nut about exercise. But they seem to enjoy it, and it's good for them, so let's just proceed. But the point of all that exercise, all of that artificial gravity, all that fluid shifting study is to understand the condition of astronauts in spaceflight to make sure that they're effective, capable, and efficient when they arrive at Mars. So when they step off the lander and they say their immortal words, they are able to go and do useful work. Unfortunately, astronauts, when they come back to Earth after a period of time equal to the transit to Mars, don't really look like this. They look more like this and even like this. And that's one of our jobs, is to understand what happens to astronauts in spaceflight and how to help them look more like this as they land on the planet Mars. In fairness to us, it may well be that astronauts will look kind of puny and peaked for the first day or so, but they seem to recover very quickly. This is a balance study that shows immediately after landing, the astronaut had essentially no balance compared to pre-flight, but the astronaut recovered his balance very, very quickly. By 3 days post-flight, he was practically back to normal. So if we can just give the astronauts a couple of days on Mars to get their Mars legs, to get their balance and their coordination back, we can probably put them right to work then within the 3 or 4 days of landing and make them go out and start doing Nobel Prize winning research to justify the expense of their mission to Mars. So when I show you this picture, this guy's probably been on Mars for a few days and is feeling pretty good by then. Earlier he didn't feel so good, but now he's feeling good enough to actually start to work. Hopefully nobody will feel this on Mars. There will be no isolated people pining for the green fields of Earth and not doing his share while the rest of them are out finding life and things like that on the planet. So our job is also to understand the psychological, psychosocial aspects of exploration missions and make sure that the other astronauts have the tools to help this person readjust and become a functioning member of their miniature society again. So you've been on Mars. I've taken a long time describing how I'm going to get you to Mars. I've taken a few minutes to describe what it's going to be like getting to Mars and what it's going to be like landing on Mars and adapting to Mars. And then fast forward 18 months, we're off of Mars. You've done all your extremely important, valuable work, and you're also 6 months into your return trip back to Earth. And now here we are getting ready to land back on Earth. During that trip back to Earth, you've been doing lots of important things, lots of simulations of upcoming mission phases. Probably almost everything you've been doing is writing reports and doing debriefs and cataloging all of the experiences you had during your 18 months on Mars. This is probably the paperwork phase of the mission, because when you've got largely 6 months of enforced solitude here to get things done, also housekeeping, and also an awful lot of exercising, because if you had to be in good shape landing on Mars, you want to make sure you're in the very best possible condition when you land back on Earth. Earth's gravity is 3 times higher than Mars's gravity, and when you land on Earth, it's very possible the president's going to be standing there to shake your hand, and you don't want to faint when you stand up in front of the president. So we're going to be doing everything we can collectively to make sure the astronauts are in their best possible condition when they land back on Earth, going through a blistering re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, splashing into the ocean, hopefully very near to the recovery forces so they don't have to do their own self-egress and self-rescue. But the important thing to remember here is that exploration is risky. And I want to take the last few slides here, and yes, I am wrapping up. You've been very patient with me. Thank you. Exploration is risky. People will be injured and possibly will die on missions like this. Let me describe why I'm saying that. These are the list of things that either have happened in spaceflight or should have happened in spaceflight. It's a long list, and we have a lot of people that are spending a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out what they can do to protect and prevent bad things from happening. But one can calculate. I think my next chart is actually a calculation based on space station experience, that is based on real-life experience on the International Space Station as a model of a spaceship with astronauts on board in space for periods that approach time and space to get to Mars. We can calculate the likelihood of medical illnesses that would require an evacuation and that would even lead to death, and injuries and trauma, and environmental factors. I told you about that hostile closed environment, when the environment actually goes bad and when it causes problems. And if you look at all of the conditions of that happen in a spaceship like the International Space Station, and probably like a Mars vehicle, that would lead to an evacuation, you have about a 1 in 6 chance of needing to evacuate during a Mars mission. Now, you can't evacuate during a Mars mission, so you've got to stand and fight. There's no place else to go. You're in the safest thing that the hand of man can provide, and that is the spaceship. And if things are going bad inside the spaceship, then it's going to really take some special effort to make things work. So there's about a 1 in 6 chance of something bad enough that you would really, really wish you had another spaceship to go to. And it's going to be about 1 in 60 or 1 in 70 of a fatality in space during these missions, if they are as safe as the space station. 1 in 67 is about the rate of loss of crew members on the space shuttle. So if we're comfortable with the space shuttle experience, and I lived through both of those crew loss experiences, and many of you did as well, if we're comfortable with that as a model of a successful space program, then the Mars program is probably going to be comparable to that, and we should feel comfortable proceeding. But we as a society need to be comfortable with the fact that not everybody that goes to Mars is going to come back intact. There may be broken limbs, even amputations because of injuries that couldn't be treated well, and there may be fatalities. That's just going to happen as we do more risky things in space. So if we're okay with that, then let's press on. And if we're not okay with that, we should probably have a nationwide dialogue and conversation about that. Personally, I think it's an acceptable level of risk. Obviously, I'm not going to go, so it's easy for me to say that. But I think we've established as a society that we're comfortable with this level of risk. So in summary, in conclusion, going to Mars is hard. You got to go really, really far away for a really long time. It takes a long time to get there, a long time to get back. It takes really, really big rockets. You generate lots and lots of energy that has to be dissipated during reentry and landing. It's just a really complicated and therefore expensive undertaking to send astronauts to Mars. So far, we've only sent robots to Mars, and this is a nice graphic illustrating every single robotic mission to Mars from 1960 all the way through the future 2020 here, and we're in 2017, which is right about here. These are all of the missions that we know of that have gone to Mars. The red ones are the Russian ones, the blue ones are the American ones, the orange one here is that's post-Soviet, that's the Russia. These are all the Soviet Union. This is Japan, this is Europe, and some other missions in here. There's India's mission. And if you can't see, but take my word for it, many of these missions end in X's. X's meant failure. Many of these missions, early missions, failed, and even today, many of a non-trivial number end in failure. Sending robots to Mars is hard. And by the way, just for your information, Mars is the only planet currently completely inhabited by robots. Just for your information. But you don't have to go to Mars to see challenging spaceflight. This is a nice graphic put together by the safety engineers at the Johnson Space Center just down the road from us here. And it shows, as well as they can document every bad thing that's happened in spaceflight that's significant. And they've color-coded several of them. The yellow ones are the things that led to fatalities. So here we see the Challenger loss during launch. Here we see the Apollo 1 fire. We just had the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 1 fire back in January of this year on the launch pad. Here you see Columbia's loss during reentry. Here you see a Russian spacecraft that decompressed and killed 3 people on reentry. Here you see a Russian spacecraft that had a parachute failure and crashed and killed a cosmonaut. So those are the fatalities. And you see there's several yellow blocks on this chart of the history of spaceflight. Other suborbital space flights and high-altitude aircraft flights as well. The brownish-looking box, or whatever color this is here, maybe pink, are mission-changing events. That is, the mission was not accomplished successfully because of something dramatic that happened in the mission. What do I mean by dramatic? Well, this one's Apollo 13. You all saw the movie. And that's the mission that went from being a lunar landing mission to a lunar flyby and survival mission. So each of these pinkish ones is another mission that changed drastically during the course of its unfolding. Each of them deserves its own movie starring Tom Hanks and produced and directed by Ron Howard. But you're probably not going to see many of them. But still, they are not rare in the history of spaceflight. And then the blue things are things that happened repeatedly that should never have happened even once. For example, in this block here are fires in the spacecraft and spaceflight. Small fires, fires behind panels or fires that burned out fairly quickly. But generally speaking, I don't know about you, but I'm really not nuts about having any kind of fire in my spaceship. And it took, in some cases, several months or even several years for the engineers to figure out, did we have a fire? Was it a significant fire? What caused it? What should we do to avoid it? And there's several blue blocks like that scattered around here. And then the ones that are just white are sort of one-off kinds of events, things that happened that were significant that probably shouldn't happen again. So I leave this with you as a graphic representation of the fact that spaceflight is indeed risky, and the risks sometimes are the greatest risk that we can expect anybody to confront, which is a fatal risk. So with that, I would like to wrap up. I thank you very much for your attention. I am here during my day job. I'm, like I say, the chief scientist for the Human Research Program. We are part of the taxpayer-supported army that is trying to understand what happens to people in spaceflight and how to make it safer and more effective and more efficient so that you feel comfortable about seeing your tax dollars used in this undertaking, in this endeavor. And that when we do propose to send people to Mars officially, you'll think it's not a bad idea, and especially after we do it one time and you say, hey, that really turned out to be a good thing, let's do it again and again and again. That's when we know we'll have succeeded. So thanks very much for your attention tonight. I'm delighted to stick around and answer questions. The question is, all that hardware that we put into orbit around Mars to support that first landing, is it going to be reused or is it going to have to be replaced? And the answer is probably yes. There's probably going to be elements that have to be replaced, like the fuel and the expendables on board have to be resupplied by another vehicle. Also, would you trust your life to a vehicle that's been orbiting Mars for 18 months and took 6 months to get there, and then it's going to be another couple of years before the next mission gets there? You would probably feel more comfortable in a brand new vehicle than in a vehicle that somebody else used and rode hard and put up wet. So I think the current thinking is, and it's not an official plan, so don't hold me to it, but the thinking is that we will see fresh sets of hardware launched each time, and one of those huge armadas of SLS rockets launching over multiple years to put all that hardware into orbit around the Earth and into orbit around Mars. I think way back when I was working with the Mars mission planners, they were thinking a minimum program would be 3 separate missions. That would be worth investing in. By that I mean there would be a first landing on Mars and then a second landing on Mars and a third landing on Mars, each involving just that much hardware. And that would probably take most of a decade just because of all the time that is spent in transit. And that might be then a good time to think about, do we want to keep doing this or do we want to think of a different way of doing it? And the reasoning behind that is probably because once you start the assembly line going, it's probably cheaper just to knock off multiples of these vehicles while the assembler line is running. and then decide later what to do differently. So thank you. Excellent question. Yeah, the question relates to bone loss during these long-term space flights. Everybody is familiar with the idea that your bones get weaker and you lose bone mass during periods in weightlessness. Turns out not so much anymore. That big exercise device I showed you seems to be protecting the bones of astronauts in spaceflight. They really don't have very much bone loss anymore now that that big exercise device is on board. So as long as they exercise for an hour a day, 6 days a week on something like that, they're probably going to be okay. There's also the possibility of giving them bisphosphonates like Fosfamax that you might be familiar with in postmenopausal females to protect them from osteoporosis. That has also been used in astronauts in spaceflight to help protect their bones. And it seems that especially the combination of exercise and Fosfamax is good for protecting the bones. That does require that we exercise very vigorously most of the time, most of the days that we're in space. That means putting one of those big exercise devices on the surface of Mars, because nobody knows whether 1/3 of a G is adequate to protect the bones or whether it's just as deleterious as zero gravity, weightlessness, in terms of the bones. It's easy. Thank you actually for bringing the question up, because it gives me another chance to talk for a second here about assumptions. We all assume that normal gravity at 1G has its normal effect on us. We have seen what the effect of weightlessness is on astronauts, and we assume that a fractional gravity has a fractional benefit. We assume 1/3 of a G is somehow 1/3 as good as normal gravity. We assume 1/6 of a G, as on the moon, is 1/6 as good as normal gravity. If I ask you, what do you mean by as 1/6 as good as or 1/3 as good as, you might just sort of give me a quizzical look, because that's almost impossible to define. What does it mean to be as good as? Does it mean it protects the bones 1/6 as much or as 1/3 as much? Does it mean that, well, what it really boils down to is the fact that we collectively don't know what the benefit of fractional gravity is. Is 1/6 of a G 1/6 as good as 1G, or maybe is it as good as 1G? Is 1/3 of a G as good as 1G, or is it only 1/3 as good as 1G? I know that sounds like I'm spouting nonsense here, but we don't know whether 1/6 and 1/3 translate both into the effectiveness of gravity as a countermeasure. It may be that time on the moon is equivalent to time in weightlessness in terms of bone loss. It may be the time on Mars is equivalent to time in weightlessness because of bone loss, because we don't have the data. So when I say that, it may be incumbent on us to then put the exercise capabilities that we would use in space onto the planetary surface, which is more mass, more power, and less living space for the astronauts to live in. So you asked a simple question. I gave you a long-winded answer because there's no such thing as a short answer in my presentations, at least. The question relates to the relative benefit of sending people to Mars versus robots to Mars. I told you that Mars is already, the only inhabitants of Mars are robots, and they're doing a darn fine job. So when you go home tonight and the robot has cooked your dinner and made your bed for you and plugged in your electric car for you and all that kind of stuff, you're comfortable with robots. When you go to work tomorrow and you sit next to the robot that's running the assembly line or doing the calculations for you, then you're comfortable with robots. Except those things don't happen. We don't have robots that can do the kind of work that humans can do. Right now, robots on Mars are taking pictures and making measurements and sending them to people back on Earth. And it turns out that if you ask one of the geologists who was the principal investigator of one of the rovers a decade or so ago, and asked him, would you like to keep sending robots or would you like to go yourself? He said, don't be nuts. Of course I want to go myself. I can do more in 45 seconds than a robot can do in a month. So if it's important to understand in a big way what's going on Mars, if it's important to look for life, look for evidence of life, make judgment on the spot, then you want to have people there. If you're okay with glacially slow exploration of the solar system, then robots are the ticket. Now, we haven't done quite so bad with robots exploring so far. I mean, especially robots on Mars have done a really good job, and none of us seems to be too unhappy with the pace of discovery on Mars. Most of us really don't pay attention to it. Once a year or once a month we look at a magazine article about the new picture from a rover on Mars. But if we're interested in getting more in-depth understanding of the environment and the possibility of life on Mars, then it's going to require something else besides robots, and it may require people on Mars A compromise might be putting people in orbit around Mars and letting them control the robots on Mars. Astronauts think that's a really dumb idea. If you're going to send me 99.9% of the way there, let me go ahead and land. But it's actually a little bit cheaper. But that's a whole different discussion. Having said all of that, I should tell you that my bias is people. And you shouldn't be surprised because I'm in the human research program. I make my paycheck studying people and how to get them to Mars. So you should not ask me what the right thing to do is. You should decide what the right thing to do is. And if it involves people, I'm your guy. If it involves robots, I need to get out. So that's a fair question. That's a very valid question for you all to be asking as part of our conversation. It's going to cost 1,000 times more to send people to Mars than to send robots to Mars. Are people 1,000 times more productive and efficient than robots? So far, I think the answer is yes. But then on the other hand, Mars has been there for billions of years. What's the hurry? Maybe really slow is just fine for saving 1,000 times as much money. It's up to us as a society to decide that. The question relates to the radiation level, and the gentleman noted that I did minimize the risk of radiation exposure in spaceflight. I shouldn't do that. It is one of our long poles. It's one of our concerns. So the radiation in low Earth orbit in the space station is about 100 times what it, I'm sorry, about 10 times what it is here for us right now, on average. So if you're experiencing about 10 times as much radiation in the space station in low Earth orbit. If you travel from the space station beyond Earth's magnetic field and go to the moon or go to Mars or any place beyond about 6 times Earth's diameter away, you're going to be experiencing 10 times more radiation. So a trip to the transit to Mars will make you experience about 100 times the radiation of the surface of the Earth. When you land on Mars, you'll be experiencing again about 10 times Earth normal radiation. Very, very smart physicists have made these calculations. They've made me memorize these numbers. So please don't ask me how I can calculate these numbers for you. But the point is, space radiation environment is nothing to be sneezed at. But we have shielding inside the spacecraft, and if there's a solar flare, then we should have provided something called a storm shelter, which would be deep in the bowels of the spaceship, probably inside of all of the water tanks to provide some protection, and with as much stuff around the outside of it as possible. And the astronauts would be instructed to wait inside that storm shelter until the worst of the solar flare has blown over, in which case they should be okay to come back out. There's also the decision to build a spacecraft of the proper kinds of materials and the proper thickness. Turns out lead's a bad idea because you can't launch enough of it, and it doesn't really protect you from all the radiation you would like it to. The standard material for building a spacecraft is aluminum, and aluminum has the habit of developing secondary radiation. So when one of these relativistic atomic nuclei from the galaxies hits the aluminum shell, it essentially fractures and makes lots of lower energy but still not very nice particles on the inside that sort of scatter through inside the vehicle. So you're essentially converting a high-speed bullet into a shotgun blast just because of the shielding of the vessel the wall of the vessel you built. If you can find yourself inside of a sufficiently thick ring of water, it can be fresh water, it can be used water. Maybe it's yesterday's coffee, it's been accumulating in tanks, or something that's very wet, or even plastics like polyethylene. You have a better protection against radiation. So the clever spacecraft designers will incorporate all of those kinds of shielding materials into the spacecraft structure to protect against radiation exposure of astronauts. But going to Mars assures you will experience greater radiation than if you stayed on the Earth. And that has to be part of the informed consent process. Don't expect to come back without additional radiation damage to your body. We'll give you the countermeasures, we'll give you the shielding, we'll give you things like antioxidants, we'll give you lifetime medical care after the fact so we can take care of any radiation-induced problems that come up. And you have to decide if it's worth going to Mars in spite of the increased risk of risk of cancer and other things like that. The question is, how realistic is The Martian? And The Martian is probably the best space movie I've seen ever. So I'd give it like a C- in terms of realism. It is much, much, much better than Space Cowboys or Armageddon or Interstellar. 2001 is actually probably a B-. 2001 didn't dare to do too much. and it did what it did pretty well given the technology and the knowledge of the technology at the time. The Martian's really good, gravity's really bad. I mean, Sandy Bullock wearing her little skimpy outfit under the spacesuit is only one of many, many technical flaws in there. If you watch Gravity, and I hope the lawyers from the movie, the company that made Gravity, are not listening, but if you watch Gravity and you look and you say, is it really like that in space? The answer is always no. And thank you very much for your very kind attention.